May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Yesterday marked the return of college football game day. Can you believe it? Now, my apologies for mixing football shows, but are you ready for some football? Speaking of football, did you know that Jackie Robinson was a much better football player than a baseball player? Actually, he was a lot better in a lot of sports. My husband was researching Jackie Robinson and shared some of the details of his life. For instance, at UCLA, Robinson's football team went undefeated. Robinson also ran track, winning the 1940 NCAA championship long jump. Baseball was considered Robinson's worst sport at UCLA. So how did this athlete, whom many considered not the best talent in the Negro League, become the first African American to play in the major leagues? How did he surpass Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, or Josh Gibson, all who I'm sure you know were clearly better players? Said with some sarcasm there. It was because of his character, Branch Rickey chose Robinson to pave the way, based not on outward achievements, but on the character of his heart. There's a well-documented conversation where Rickey, manager of the Dodgers, asked Robinson if he could stand up to the coming abuse without fighting back. Paraphrasing, Robinson replied, "Do you want someone who is afraid to fight back?" Rickey responded, "Robinson, I'm looking for a baseball player with enough guts not to fight back." And that's what Jesus is trying to tell us today, that it is about our character, our hearts that matter. It is not the checking off of boxes per se that counts. It is the thought, the meaning, the intentions behind our actions. Today we hear of Pharisees who come all the way from Jerusalem to track Jesus down. And prior to today's lesson, Mark shares stories of the feeding of the 5,000, walking on water, healing the sick. And the 12 have been sent out, and they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. Despite these visions of Jesus' identity and marvelous power, despite the indwelling of God's kingdom, the Pharisees complain about Jesus not teaching his disciples the proper rules of the elders. Now, the tradition of the elders is the oral interpretation of the Mosaic law. There is a common saying among rabbis that when God gave the tablets of law to Moses, God also whispered in Moses' ear the proper rules of correct interpretation and application. But interpreting law is what we all do. Jesus says to love our neighbors, so at Christ Church we apply that by participating in the Feed My Sheep program. We show love by providing food to our neighbors. But in the case of our gospel story, the tradition held that folks must wash their hands before eating. And remember that germs were not discovered until the 17th century. Because the washing the Pharisees are talking about is ritual washing. In the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Mosaic, the law of Moses, says that priests are to ritually clean their hands before attending to sacred duties within sacred space. You may remember pre-COVID when the acolyte would bring over a bowl called a lavabo, and I would hold my hands over the lavabo while the acolyte poured water over my hands. This ritual cleaning comes from this Mosaic law. Well, the Pharisees decided to do one better. Their tradition had everybody washing their hands as a kind of boundary marker around their faith. It was a way for the Jews to proclaim their identity as distant from their pagan neighbors. Therefore, the Pharisees claimed, if Jesus is not teaching his disciples this ritual, this tradition of the elders, then Jesus must not be the rabbi, the teacher that folks claim him to be. Now, as usual in his response, Jesus skips right over the question, in this case, ritual washing, and instead focuses on the heart of the matter. Jesus says, you abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. Meaning that the Pharisees were paying more attention to the traditions that they valued than to the point that the traditions were trying to express. It's a common human problem. We set something up to help us understand the ways of God and then forget about God. We complain that Jesus is healing on a Sabbath versus showing love through the gift of healing. How can we flip this? How can we stay focused on God? The way to do that, Jesus continues, is to look at your heart. Faith is from within. From the human heart, the evil intentions come. A quick explanation here. Biblical Jews refer to the heart as the seat of emotional and intellectual life. The three special functions, knowing, feeling, and willing, ascribed by modern psychologists to the mind, were attributed to the heart by the biblical writers. So it is from our thoughts, our brains, our hearts, that our love flows. We are called to walk the talk, to not be hypocritical. Jesus quotes Isaiah talking about hypocrites saying, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. I once served at a church that was a plant. They built a square, somewhat plain building with the intention of turning it into offices and educational space. They would convert the space after they had built their cathedral, the sanctuary of their dreams. In the meantime, the church was worshiping in this plain space, 4 beige walls with a clear glass window. But when it came time to build the beautiful church building, the congregation nixed the plans. Instead, they used the money for outreach, providing food and education for their neighbors in need. And oh yes, they did buy some paint to cover those beige walls. But here was a church that threw out the traditions right out the window in favor of serving God. Now, that is not to say that beautiful buildings such as ours are a bad thing. Absolutely not. It is a way for many to find God and to worship God. Because remember that it's not about the action, but it is about the intention, the heart. And one of the ways that we can push the evil intentions out of our heart is by discipleship. Being the kind of person that grows to become more and more like Jesus. Filling our hearts and brains with love, peace, and joy. The Sacred Ground course helps us to do this. This is a learning series sponsored by the Episcopal Church, which holds the vision of the beloved community as a guiding star, where all people are honored and protected and nurtured, practicing the way of love and the pattern of Jesus. Now, it's a big ask, 10 weeks over the course of several months, but it is also one of those life-changing programs where you will be glad you spent the time. And I hope you will consider signing up for Sacred Ground. And there are, of course, numerous other ways to plant your attentions in God's kingdom, to not value any sacred cows above the love of God. So check your emails for all the options available here at Christ Church. Shortly before his death, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Jackie Robinson made my success possible. Without him, I would have never been able to do what I did. Who will you inspire today? How will you inspire them? Let us not be hypocrites. And as our colleague says, Lord of all power and might, graft in our hearts the love of your name. Amen.